Right, well, this week we have seen potentially the boldest moment of Keir Starmer's leadership as the government announced its white paper, Restoring Control Over the Immigration System. Catchy title. According to the Prime Minister, it marks a significant overhaul of UK immigration policy. The headlines, however, have been a little less kind, focusing on the wording of his speech and a specific phrase, which was Island of Strangers. And some have been really quick to compare this to Enoch Powell's infamous River of Blood speech, in which Powell talks of white British people becoming, quote, strangers in their own country. Andrew, I mean, how fair is this comparison or criticism?
I think the language chosen was unfortunate, to put it that way. If you look at what Powell was saying, he was saying very much that white people were becoming strangers because they were surrounded by black and brown people. And the phrasing of the Prime Minister's words is more that there is a danger, we're not there yet, but there is a danger of a country in which different communities don't understand each other. Everybody's a stranger. In other words, I think the sort of focus of it, the locus of it, the perspective is different. But I think any echo of Enoch Powell is really, really unfortunate and really damaging. I think there's an awful lot in the policy which is virtuous and is worth talking about, but the language it was sold with was not great. Nigel Farage very, very effectively punched the bruise at Prime Minister's questions this week, congratulating Keir Starmer on adopting reform language. That was even more painful, I think, for Keir Starmer than the full frontal attack from Plaid Cymru about him not having any moral compass. So it has been most uncomfortable for him. He must have noticed, and he must be regretting the phrase.
Well, we were talking about this, weren't we, in the office yesterday, Rachel, about whether it was just a mistake, unfortunate, and we'll come on to the policy in a minute. But I mean, what are your thoughts?
So I think when it was written as the entirety of the line, which is an island of strangers, not a nation that moves forward together, and that's very Starmer language, the idea of a nation moving forward together. We've heard lines like that from him before, and I don't think he necessarily realised how the first bit of it, taken in isolation, would sound. So I don't buy this idea that it was a conscious or deliberate echoes. And I think there have been a lot of political speeches over many, many, many decades. You can probably find similarities with many of them to bring out. I don't think that was the intention. I think Downing Street is a bit surprised by how emotive that phrase has been, in a similar way to the fact that Theresa May was surprised and taken aback by how people reacted to her Citizens of Nowhere line when she was Prime Minister in 2016, and that was a line that I don't think she realised how people would take that and how that would sound. So you do get these kind of phrases out of context that are very emotive. That said, there is other really quite hardline language that Starmer used, not just in the speech, but in the introduction to the white paper. He talks about how uncontrolled immigration did uncalculable damage to the UK, not put social cohesion at risk, not created trade-offs, all of which are things that we can talk about, incalculable damage. And I thought that was really punchy. And that line has sort of got missed in the Island of Strangers discourse.
But this is a really, really important moment in the change in thinking on mass immigration from inside the Labour government. I was talking to somebody who's a senior minister during the Blair years, and they were worried even back then at the rate of immigration, the rate of net immigration, but all the way through the Treasury had an absolutely clear line: immigration, mass immigration is good for the country. That is the driver of growth. And I think what's happened is that, we've had flatlining growth and very, very high immigration. And that link between the two things has been broken intellectually. And then that leads to all sorts of questions about the pressure on public services, the pressure on housing, the pressure on schools and the rest of it. So I think again, very, very hard and punchy language, but he is signalling there that the fundamental thinking on immigration has changed. Don't forget that in 2023, net immigration was close to 1 million people in this country. We've had, under the Tories, the last 4 or 5 years of the Tory years, we've had absolutely huge quantities of immigration of a kind we never saw before. We didn't see it in the 60s or the 50s or anywhere else before. So it's about numbers, as it always is.
Well, let's dive into some of the details, because Andrew, I mean, you used an interesting word, virtuous. You said some of the suggestions in it. Why do you use? That's an interesting word to use.
Well, I think if you believe that an awful lot of people, looking at 1 million people coming in each year, say this is not sustainable, we're furious about it, and you're a democratically elected government and you choose to shrug them off and turn your back, then that is the wrong thing to do. And therefore, the question is, how can you mitigate the very, very large quantities of immigration if you think it is overall economically damaging for the country, apart from anything else, because of wage suppression, which is real, and because of the lack of training and skills for people who've been here a very long time and who don't move into these jobs. If you take all of that, then you have a problem about how you mitigate humanely and decently and correctly. And I think some of the measures they put in place, if we take the student visa route, then it's pretty clear that quite a lot of people have been overstaying their visas. Yet we need students. A lot of our universities depend upon overseas students because they're the ones who pay the fees. And so the government was pressed to cut, you can stay on for 2 years with no problem, to cut that to 1 year. And in fact, they've just cut it to 18 months. So I think where they can mitigate and do it more gently, that's what they're trying to do. And indeed, the criticism from the right is that these measures, underneath the hard language, aren't nearly strong enough.
What are some of the other measures outlined, Rach?
So the student visa one is a big one. The other really big headline one is closing the social care visa route, which is something that I'm sure we're going to be talking about a lot in future, because there's a crisis in social care and the government hasn't really outlined how it's going to pay the higher social care wages that you would need to encourage UK workers to take those jobs. I mean, there was a reason that the Boris Johnson government wanted to recruit very heavily from overseas. Now, the criticism around that visa is people came on a social care visa, maybe they then immediately went into another job, maybe they were sponsored by a company that was a little bit dodgy, in some cases didn't exist and didn't provide social care. There were quite relaxed rules on bringing over dependents on those visas. And so tightening up that system was something that the Conservative government were looking very closely at, but it does leave you with a real recruitment crisis in a occupation that already has really quite dire shortages. Other changes, making it harder for UK companies to recruit from overseas. They have to show that they've tried to find British workers to do that, and makes it more expensive. And then the other really eye-catching one is around indefinite leave to remain. So this is the number of years you have to have lived in the UK before you're eligible to apply for indefinite leave to remain. Once you've got indefinite leave to remain, then you can look into the process of applying for citizenship. Yeah, they've doubled it from 5 years to 10 years, which is actually Kemi Badenoch's only policy, really. It's the only policy to come out of the Conservatives in opposition. Not that you would know that. You'd expect the Conservatives to be going, oh, they borrowed our policy, but they haven't been saying that. And the really eye-catching thing about that is when it was announced, there were questions about, is this going to refer to people coming to the UK from now, or is it going to refer to people who are already in the country? And Yvette Cooper has indicated that she wants it to refer to people who are already here, which means it could potentially, subject to court challenges, apply to the people who came here. That figure that you mentioned, 900,000 in 2023, the Boris wave, so-called, of migrants who came here from 2020 onwards. And that's really significant, because that means that there are going to be hundreds of thousands of people who came to the UK, have worked in the UK for a number of years, thinking that at 5 years they would get what's essentially settled status. And now that's being doubled to 10 years. So that's really quite controversial.
It is tough, but I come back to the same thing. I mean,
it's very popular.
It's very popular. The net immigration is now running at about 700,000. So it's year after year after year of absolutely historically, unknown before figures. And you have to do, if you're going to do something about it, you have to do something about it.
I mean, it struck me, I don't know what you guys think, that there are a couple of things in there that were, I think, relatively uncontroversial, that most people, wherever you sit politically, would agree with. One
learning English, for instance.
Yeah, learning English, but also having a high skills threshold, apart from when there are shortages. And this idea that foreign criminals do not get to stay here. I mean, it seems pretty reasonable to me.
Yeah.
That's a difficult one, though, for Keir Starmer specifically, because the rules under which people can challenge their deportations is the kind of international law, international frameworks that Keir Starmer has been very supportive of, even before he was a politician, throughout his entire career. So one of the things the white paper says is they're going to tighten up some of those loopholes, not going to leave the ECHR, but to try and change the culture by which these deportations can be challenged in the courts. I think that is going to throw up legal challenges and issues where the government is forced to make a choice, essentially, between what the judges applying international law are saying and what the government wants to do.
That is one thing that confused me, Andrew, because it said we're going to tighten up what how the judges can interpret. It's going to be challenged, isn't it?
It is going to be challenged. What I'm hearing, and who knows what will happen, is that quite a few European countries are likely to come together and rewrite bits of the ECHR because it was written in a completely different world in the 1950s, and definitions of asylum, etc., are possibly going to be changed, because this is a problem, obviously, for Germany and France and Italy and Spain as well. So there may be a move on that coming. We're going to hear it.
That's fascinating.
That's absolutely. It's a big thing, and we I heard it, but that doesn't mean it's going to happen. We started off by saying this is a really, really big moment for the government, and in terms of what's the nature of the government, what's the essence of the government, is this really a kind of Farageist government emerging? All of that stuff is very, very important. But we're in the middle of a slew of really big government changes coming. Next week, we're going to see a summit with the EU, which I think is going to be the first moment where we make a big turn back towards not the EU, but towards Europe. There's a huge tilt coming next week. The defence review is coming out possibly even next week. And the big question overhanging a lot of what Rachel's been saying, and we've been saying in the New Statesman generally, is what happens to economic policy. And we've had one of the key advisors to Rachel Reeves, who's just left, saying in the papers today that there is no way forward except for higher taxes. She's just going to have to raise taxes later this year. So we are in the middle of a kind of tumult of different announcements, of which the immigration one is only one.
But how is that all playing out? Perhaps quietly, it might get louder within the Labour Party, because some, particularly on the left of the party, will not be happy at all with this kind of rhetoric, will they?
That's right. Well, I was interviewing Richard Bergen, for instance, who said that the language was disgraceful and that Keir Starmer needed to apologise very fast. Jeremy Corbyn, perhaps not surprisingly, said he no longer recognised the Labour Party. But, partly thanks to the ruthless selection of candidates at the last general election, there is not a really big united, determined left group inside the Commons at the moment. I thought it was a bit unfair, a bit mean, in a way, that Diane Abbott, who is the mother of the House, was bobbing up and down all the way through Prime Minister's questions, clearly wanting to speak about this, and we kind of guessed what she was going to say, and was never once called by the Speaker. So there are voices out there. But the Labour left, organised inside the party, is pretty weak at the moment. It's a long time since the heydays of momentum. And outside the Labour Party, the Greens are still not organised, still not mobilised, still not perhaps effective enough to mop up a lot of votes. So Starmer, I don't think at this stage, is panicking when he looks to his left.
Are the Tories panicking at this, Rachel? Because obviously we've got Robert Jenrick, who's clearly desperate to be leader of the Conservative Party. He's saying it doesn't go far enough, but it strikes me that, do they have a right to say anything? Haven't been in power and brought us record levels of immigration. What are people saying? Because you've written for the New Statesman this week.
Yeah, there's a sense among some Tories, not publicly, I should say, but a sort of mood of, wait, why didn't we do this? Was this an option? If that was an option, nobody told us this was an option. And if you look at the changes to immigration that Rishi Sunak made when he was Prime Minister, it really is very mild tinkering around the edges compared to the white paper. You can argue that the white paper doesn't go far enough, as the Conservatives are doing. But if you look at the measures that they were proposing, it goes a lot further than that. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is fear of the economic consequences, because business groups are really concerned about some of these changes, particularly to universities. And we can have a debate about the economic merits of immigration or not. But you do have the Treasury sort of stuck there going, maybe don't do this. And that was obviously a factor for Rishi Sunak. I think a bigger one, though, was the fact that the biggest wave of migration in 2023, that came as a direct result of changes to the immigration system implemented by Boris Johnson post-Brexit, this points-based immigration system that we had. And it was very difficult for Boris Johnson's successor, Rishi Sunak, if you just leave Liz Truss to one side for a moment, to go, yeah, he got that wrong and he screwed it up spectacularly. And perhaps Rishi Sunak should have done that. And we talked actually at the time on this podcast about why he wasn't distancing himself more from Boris Johnson's legacy. And there were all kinds of internal Tory party infighting reasons for that. But it did make it difficult for the Conservatives to enact the kind of measures that matched the rhetoric. And that was why Sunak relied so heavily on measures to tackle illegal immigration, the Rwanda scheme, which is obviously a completely separate thing. And it's not the first time as well that I have heard Conservatives look at what the Starmer government is doing and go, oh, we would have loved to have done that. So scrapping NHS England is a big one. Also diverting some of the money from international aid to bolster defence spending. And there are, again, good reasons why they felt unable to do that. If you're at the end of a government, you don't have as much political capital. The NHS changes, you've got to look back to who it was who enacted those NHS changes. Again, it's about not criticising your immediate predecessor's legacy. But as much as there are many Labour MPs who are really disconcerted with what the Starmer government is doing, and there really are, there are also quite a lot of quietly admiring Conservative MPs who are just looking at it and going, oh, I didn't know that was an option.